Hello everyone, my name is Jane Trudeau, and for my presentation, I will be discussing the function that magical realism serves in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel 100 Years of Solitude. Sorry in advance for any mispronunciation, especially of the name. Briefly summarize the novel for those of you who did not have the time to read it. 100 Years of Solitude follows the lives of 7 generations of the Buenda family from the 1820s to the 1920s. Across all generations of the family, history continues to repeat itself, as the same pitfalls of incest and obsession with scientific advancement are met again and again. The novel takes place in the author's homeland of Colombia, wherein the story's characters are forced to live out real parts of Colombia's history, including the Banana Massacre, which took place in 1928, just 1 year after Marquez was born. Although the novel obviously has a unique plot, what elevated the novel to receiving worldwide recognition is Marquez's utilization of magical realism. In magical realism, authors depict fantastical and magical scenarios as being mundane and ordinary. They achieve this effect by having the story's characters show little to no reaction to seeing magical things and having the narrator describe magical scenarios with abject and blunt language. And it's extremely difficult to pinpoint exactly when magical realism came about because it can be seen in fairy tales, ancient legends, and oral histories throughout time and across different countries. Though one of the earliest recognized literatures to be considered magical realism is 101 Arabian Nights. Modern magical realist texts were largely influenced by Latin America authors, including Marquez, whose works brought magical realism to international attention. Though Marquez himself admits that his use of magical realism was influenced by his reading of The Metamorphoses by American author Franz Kafka, which is about a man who transforms into a bug. In preparation for my presentation, I read Magical Realism in Literature, which is a collection of essays that discusses magical realism and its history and function. I would like to touch on the premise of the 4th essay in the compilation titled Insubstantial Selves and Magical Realism in the Americas, because I think its points apply to 100 Years of Solitude. The essay suggests that in magical realist texts, it is a common occurrence for its characters to be seen as being a part of a collective with their family or community rather than individuals with their own separate goals and motivations. This is evident in 100 Years of Solitude as each generation of the Buenda family has the same characteristics and experiences as the one before it, to the point that the same names are passed down, with Joses Arcadios and Aurelios becoming a kind of archetype within the story. The essay does not provide any reason for why magical realist texts often have characters defined by their relation to others, but I assume it is because in having characters function as a group, it makes the characters themselves have a kind of surreal quality that makes them to fit into the narrative of magical realism. If the characters seem more realistic, it would make their dismissal of magical occurrences seem more noticeable, which would betray the point of the genre. In treating characters as one collective whole, magical realist writers are also able to focus the reader's attention onto the messaging of the book, as opposed to the character. In addition to this, I believe that by having the characters all behave in similar ways, the reader becomes swept up into a kind of group thing, wherein because all of the characters in the novel have nearly the same response to things, the reader unconsciously accepts that their responses are natural, which persuades them to think the same. I noticed this in myself, personally, while reading the text, as the more characters I saw share a lack of response to all magical components of the story, the more conditioned I became to remaining unfazed when something magical took place. For any of you interested in reading more in depth about the prevalence of collective identity in magical realist texts, I provided a link to an online downloadable copy of the book I referenced for this in the video's description. Another premise about magical realism is offered in the book Magical Realism and the History of the Emotions in Latin America, which covers the historical context in which magical realism gained prominence in Latin America. This will also be linked below. Although the main points of the book are informative, what really caught my attention was a comment they made about magical realism, which was, what people believe about their reality is also part of that reality. This line really stuck with me because it helped me better understand why Marquez utilized magical realism in certain parts of his novel, such as when Jose Arcadio Buendio is introduced to new discoveries and scientific advancements by the traveling Romanians who visited his town. In order to relay to the reader how magical these inventions must have seemed to Jose Arcadio Buendio, Marquez reshapes these real inventions to be more exaggerated and magical so that the reader can feel the same sense of wonder and fascination. A point I thought of on my own about magical realism as I read through 100 Years of Solitude is how it interferes with a person's moral judgment. Because the world of the story does not abide by the rules of logic and science that apply to reality, the reader is made to further suspend their sense of disbelief. And since the characters in 100 Years of Solitude are also unrealistic, the reader also chooses to overlook their strange behaviors because we assume that, like other magical occurrences, their behavior would be considered normal for their world. As such, when the characters commit immoral acts such as cheating on their spouse, engaging in incest, or plotting to kill one another, their actions seem less deplorable than the reader would normally think because the reader is made to think that if the world of the story operates on different logic, then it must also have different moral standards. Because the characters seem so fantastical, it is difficult for the reader to judge them with the same moral standards that they would judge characters that seem more grounded in reality. Applying our world's moral standards to the Buenda family feels like applying human moral standards to a different species that has different norms and rules. The surrealness of the Buendas also makes it very difficult to empathize with the characters, especially considering that, as I said before, the Buendas are less individual people as they are one collective identity. The last point I would like to make is that although magical realism is a useful tool for depicting history because it allows deeper empathy for the victims of history by portraying events with magic in a way that evokes a sense of surprise or lack of understanding that the victims of such events would have experienced, can also unintentionally result in misunderstandings about history. For instance, in the article Fiction as History, Bananeras and Gabriel García Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, I discovered that apparently, according to the responses Marquez gave in an interview, not nearly as many people died in the Banana Massacre as his novel led me, and I'm sure many others, to believe. Understandably, Marquez decided to exaggerate the number of deaths for his novel in order to relay how tragic and impactful that moment was in Colombian history. But because his novel is the first time many people, including myself, are introduced to the Banana Massacre, it is natural for people to assume that he is presenting a factual description of events. The reason I think it's so easy to believe that the non-magical information Marquez presents is fact is that as a reader we understand that the magical components of the story are meant to be fictional, so we assume that in contrast, the realistic aspects of the novel must be an accurate representation of reality. After all, once the magic and magical realism is stripped away, we expect what remains to be reality. This can be problematic because in trying to give voice to silenced moments in history, Marquez accidentally leaves uninformed readers with the wrong version of that history. That is all I have to say on this topic. I hope you took something away from this video and developed a better understanding of magical realism.